This week, Prime Minister Mark Carney unveiled his new cabinet, and 3 Indigenous members of Parliament will be part of his inner circle. One of the most notable appointments is Mastis, a former Grand Chief of the Grand Council of the Crees in Quebec. She's become the first Indigenous person to head up Indigenous Services Canada. For more, our Truth in Politics panel is here. Negon Sinclair is a columnist with the Winnipeg Free Press, and helping us out this week, Cassidy, the former president of the Métis National Council and a principal with First Peoples Group. Negon, we'll start with you and your initial thoughts on the makeup of this cabinet.
Well, a record number of Indigenous MPs. We've never seen 3 before. We've seen close to 3 a number of periods of time. And so that's significant. I think Mandy Galmasti will have an overwhelming job that she's got to hit the ground running dealing with the unfinished issue of child welfare with the Assembly of First Nations. She's got an ongoing series of challenges with Métis people across the country, particularly situations involving the MNO. She's also got a huge issue of forest fires and flooding, which is now occurring and creating emergency situations. And then we have Buckley Belanger, as we should be pronouncing the name properly. Buckley's going to be in a situation, the only Liberal MP of Northern Saskatchewan, a huge issue of separatism going in the province. But the real wild card is Rebecca Chartrand. Not only does she have to handle the fact she's the only MP from Manitoba, the most significant growing Indigenous population in the country, she's also the head of 1/3 of the province. That's a huge riding, the second biggest riding in the country. And now she's also in charge of the North. And I mean, Arctic sovereignty, issues of resource development in the North. And never mind the fact that now we have an Indigenous woman who, in Manitoba, is, of course, a position of historical harm, historical mistreatment. And now we're asking an Indigenous woman to take on the most complicated portfolio in this cabinet and maybe in Canadian history. I think it's a very interesting time, and I wish her luck. I wish all of them luck, in fact.
Absolutely. And Cassidy, your thoughts on the new cabinet?
Yeah, I think it was a really well thought through cabinet with representation from all across the country. Definitely the highlight would be the 3 out of 38 cabinet ministers being Indigenous, and a little bit of math on that. That's almost 8% of the cabinet. And with 5% of Indigenous peoples in this country of our population, it's almost the first time that we're actually overrepresented in a situation. So on this cabinet, which is really fantastic to see. We're moving the needle on representation in this country. I agree with Negon there. Big file for Rebecca Chartrand. Taking over that file for Dan Vandal, who was a Métis man who held the Northern Affairs file right before this election, but adding in the Arctic affairs. And of course, with Arctic sovereignty being a massive conversation throughout this election, it's a big file for her. But looking forward to seeing how our strong Indigenous women can take on these files and do a really good job.
You know, Negon, you gave us a brief roundup there earlier, but let's talk about Mandy Galmasti. In a historic move, she'll become she is the first status Indian Minister of Indigenous Services Canada. What do you think of that move?
Well, the first Indigenous I would say, Dan Vandal certainly did an incredible job bringing sensibility. Leonel Gluckluck brought, of course, the longest-serving Indigenous cabinet minister to the cabinet of Stephen Harper. These are really significant Indigenous leaders, but Mandy Galmasti will be the first Indigenous leader of an Indigenous-specific department. That means that she will bring a sensibility to that department that I think is similar. And if we want to see a template, we can look to Manitoba of what it means when you have an Indigenous person in a significant power position. We can think back to some of the work that Jody Wilson-Raybould did when she was literally the right hand of the Prime Minister for a short period of time. And as Mandy Galmasti not only brings the sensibility of being a Grand Chief, but also a leader within her own community. when you are a leader within your own community, chiefs do 3 times the job as any other political leader in this country. They are the prime minister, they are the premier, they are mayors all at the same time, having to deal with internal issues, external issues, diplomacy, even down to the very basic tenets of infrastructure on First Nations. And Mandy Galmasti will now be in charge of dealing with all of that. And having experience on the ground, knowing exactly what's happening in First Nations and in many cases Métis communities, this is going to be a critical part of understanding and moving those communities forward, particularly in rural areas in which there's boil water advisories, which there's areas of real critical issues involving housing, which is a part of Mark Carney's agenda. This will be really critical to bridge all of those things together, and I hope that Mandy Galmasti will be a significant voice at the table and will be listened and believed when she speaks.
Cassidy, people in the past have called for an Indigenous person to head up the department. Do you think this could be a good thing?
I think it can. For Indigenous Services Canada, yes, it can. I was wondering before the cabinet shuffle, with all the talks about making it a streamlined cabinet, making it smaller than previous Trudeau cabinets, if they were going to consider putting Indigenous Services Canada back with Crown Indigenous Relations. Personally, I'm happy to see that they didn't. Those are 2 very significant and distinct files. Had they done that, I don't think it could be an Indigenous person as the Minister of Crown Indigenous Relations. But Indigenous Services Canada, absolutely yes. And Niigaan mentioned diplomacy. Mandy Galmasti has a significant amount of experience being a diplomat for her community. She was part of the delegation to the Vatican, advocating for the apology from Pope Francis. So she's done a lot of this work on the international stage, the national stage, the local stage, provincial. She'll bring a lot to the file. I know she'll do a good job, not only just with her own file, but with this smaller cabinet as well. There's opportunity for her voice to be heard on all files. I think that there's going to be opportunity for all cabinet ministers to be able to work together collaboratively throughout their files. They're not going to be working in silos. And so for Mandy Galmasti to be at that table, to have her voice heard and to represent as an Indigenous woman on all of those files, I think she'll do a good job. There is a significant amount of work to be done within Indigenous Services Canada, as Niigaan mentioned, the child welfare, the child reform, following the Supreme Court decision on C-92, the implementation of child welfare services for our own nations, but also the calls for the introduction of the clean water legislation. There's been calls from chiefs saying that they want that legislation reintroduced in 100 days. That's significant. That's a big ball to pick up and get going again, as well as the distinctions-based health legislation, working with First Nations, Métis, and Inuit on a distinctions-based approach to make sure that health legislation is passed for Indigenous peoples in this country. Some significant issues that she has to tackle, but again, I have a lot of faith in her as a strong Indigenous woman.
Niigaan, you were saying even before she was elected that Manitoba MP Rebecca Chartrand would have a role to play in the Mark Carney government. She will be Minister of Arctic and Northern Affairs. What do you make of that appointment?
Yeah, I'm proud to say that I knew very early on that she brings things to the cabinet that are fairly unprecedented. Not only is she have a great deal of urban experience when it comes to Indigenous issues, but she also brings rural experience. I mean, she now represents the 2nd biggest riding in the country. It's very significant that all 3 Indigenous MPs represent in many ways the North. In fact, there is one gaping hole, I think, in that we don't see as much representation of urban areas across the entirety of the cabinet. Most of the cabinet ministers out of those 38 represent areas that not in the past Liberals have had a lot of strength in. There are, of course, people who represent cities within the Liberals, but within the cabinet, we see a lot more rural representation, which is a frequent criticism of Justin Trudeau's cabinets, is that they were very urban-centric. Rebecca Chartrand brings both. She brings a long history in Winnipeg as an educator and anti-racism advocate. She also brings a lot of history involving murdered missing Indigenous women and girls, Two-Spirit peoples. And so she has a lot of history with that issue. Then she also is an artist, a person who toured throughout the North, person who worked in anti-racism, particularly as a business owner, working with First Nations communities, Métis communities throughout the North. And if you see her bio, she both recognizes as a First Nations and a Métis person. So that just says that there is a lot of things that she brings to that portfolio that will be dynamic and interesting. And for all the reasons I listed out earlier, I think she heads up the most complicated. I was having some debates yesterday with several media people on different TV shows about whether this is the most complicated portfolio. I stand by what I say. I think this is the most complicated portfolio in the entirety of the cabinet, because not only do you have to head up a province, you're the general of that province, you're also now representing Indigenous peoples, both urban and rural, in lots of different ways. And then, of course, the issue of murder, missing Indigenous women and girls, which she will probably be one of the lead voices on that for the government. And then on top of that, the Arctic. She's dealing with now Russia. She's dealing with all of the different issues around minerals and oil development, and then all the different complicated ways in which Inuit, Tlicho communities are all advocating for really critical mineral development. I mean, these are just not easy things to navigate. And when I spoke to her after her election, and she had mentioned that she was looking at cabinet, and particularly the Arctic portfolio, I said, that's going to be a very difficult way. It's going to be a lot of time on the road. And I think that she's prepared for that, and she certainly has told me that she's wanting to do that for not just Indigenous peoples, but for all Canadians as well.
Yeah, thanks for that, Niigaan. And Cassidy, Buckley Belanger, the only Liberal MP in all of Saskatchewan, will serve as Secretary of State for Rural Development. How do you think he will fare in that position?
I think he's going to do a fantastic job. I saw him already do a couple of media hits yesterday, or a couple of days ago now, when they had their first cabinet meeting, talking about how, he sees his role as a bridge to bring the country together. Of course, unity being another big topic in this new government, bringing Canada together. For him to be the sole Liberal representative in Saskatchewan, and if you look at the map, it's half the province. He has a large role to play. He has some significant experience, though, and some strong support in that province. I think he'll be able to have some support. He'll be able to play a supporting role in bridging the West back into the country here. Especially, coming into June, there's going to be a First Minister's meeting. It's going to be held in Saskatchewan. I think that Prime Minister Carney will lean on Buckley Belanger to play a significant role there as well, again, as a liaison, as a support person in that province. So happy to see that. I know our Métis communities are thrilled to see him elevated to cabinet, to have him speak Cree during the swearing in at the cabinet shuffle was really great. And again, that representation matters. So happy to see Buckley play a strong role in this.
Niigaan, is there any big picture being painted by Mark Carney with this makeup of his inner circle?
There's something really interesting that one of my fellow colleagues pointed out to me, Shannon Proudfoot. And she said, one thing about Mark Carney is he constantly says he's a pragmatist. And you don't see a lot of sort of what she called sermonizing with Mark Carney. You actually didn't hear this whole, like, if you think back to Justin Trudeau, we would have seen a headline, most Indigenous cabinets in Canadian history. But you didn't see that with Mark Carney. What you saw was a very pragmatic approach, not a lot of advertising or talk about representation. On one level, I think that's a missed opportunity, but on another level, I guess it just indicates the kind of government that Mark Carney's interested in doing. He's interested specifically about the economy. He's going to need many people to be on the side of that economy. And perhaps what his approach will look like is that we're not too interested in engaging all the different, perhaps, as to use Cassidy's terms, distinctions in this conversation. That may be a problem. I'm not sure. Well, I guess the proof will be whether this will be a successful strategy going forward. But he's really interested in trying to get everybody on a page to say this is about facing Donald Trump. This is about facing a national unity crisis or facing a national program. I mean, we can't just ignore history, but at the same time, it is somewhat interesting that he then provides a vision that really is trying to, in many ways, bring everybody along. And we see it's working in lots of corners. Quebec separatism's down. We have the First Nations premier of a Canadian province, Wab Kinew, standing in front of the legislature with a big Canada flag, talking about how patriotic he is, with a huge cabinet of LGBTQ2+ and Indigenous peoples, Black Canadians. There is some very interesting trends going on, and I think that there's an atmosphere that I think everybody understands that there is a common battle, a common enemy, and that would be the United States threats against Canada.
Cassidy, your thoughts on what this government and makeup of cabinet will mean for Indigenous peoples?
I think, again, I've mentioned it before, I'll say it again, representation matters. We didn't see as many Indigenous peoples running for members of parliament throughout this last election. But then to see the most Indigenous peoples elected, and then now the most Indigenous peoples on cabinet, I think that's going to create a larger shift in this country. And it's not just tokenistic appointments. These are cabinet positions. These are serious roles that Indigenous peoples are going to be playing in our government. Just yesterday, too, Prime Minister Carney announced the cabinet committees that are going to be moving forward. And again, you see Rebecca Chartrand on the Secure and Sovereign Canada Committee. You see, again, Rebecca Chartrand and Rebecca Alty, who is not Indigenous but is heading up the Crown Indigenous Relations portfolio in the Build Canada Cabinet Committee. And that one has a large role to play in Indigenous economic prosperity. So you're going to be seeing these people working together for Indigenous economic prosperity on these committees. And again, Mandy-Gull Masty playing a role in the Quality of Life and Wellbeing Cabinet Committee. So again, we have Indigenous peoples in the House of Commons, we have Indigenous peoples on the side of government, and now we have them in cabinet, holding these cabinet positions and also on these cabinet committees. That is going to change the future. Having these strong voices in there, I hope that they have the support to continue to do this work in a good way, because we don't want them burning out. We don't want them, we don't want to see less people involved in the future. And so they are going to be setting a strong example of how Indigenous peoples can play a role within these systems.
You're both right. It'll be interesting to see as time goes on how this plays out. Just want to thank you, Tapwagi Chit, to both of you for doing Truth in Politics today.
You gotcha. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thanks, TR.